to USU 1300, our second lecture for Tuesday, March 24th. It's actually good that we do these, or I would forget what day of the week it was. So we have Harley with us again today, and Aiden's joining us as well. And today we are going to talk about the two-party system, specifically in the context of primaries, and really focus on this question of how does somebody get elected in the United States. And we're going to address that largely from the perspective of national office. So if I was running for the presidency, if I was running for the Senate, if I was running for the House of Representatives, looking at the primary and kind of understanding more about what that does in channeling potential candidates into a general election. So before we start that, if you're a student in the class, hopefully you've posted a video response or Flipgrid, and I had a chance to view some of those, and I did want to talk a little bit about a couple of the questions that I saw pop up. One of the things that Harley had also mentioned, and I saw several of you talk about, was again this question about third-party candidates. If we do have a two-party system, which we do, and it is bipolar and it's hard to break in, then how can a third-party candidate really have a shot at one of these national offices? And we touched briefly on this last Thursday, but I thought it might be helpful to talk a little bit more about it today, which is, again, you as a third-party candidate have to overcome this initial loyalty towards party that both Democrats and Republicans have for their own candidate. And so if you look at independent candidates right now in the Senate or the House, do you guys know who any of those might be?
No.
One is Bernie Sanders, right? We talked about this
right,
last week. He's not actually a Democrat. He's an independent from Vermont. So he's one of our independents. So if Bernie Sanders is going to get elected to represent Vermont in the Senate, that means that people of Vermont have to personally identify with him in a way that they don't with a Republican or a Democratic nominee. Now, Sanders is very progressive, right? He's very liberal, and so it would be hard for a Democratic nominee to kind of out progressive Sanders because he's at the very far left of what liberal progressives kind of look as their political ideology. And Vermont's a pretty liberal state, and so a Republican wouldn't really have a whole lot of, wouldn't have an easy path to go ahead and upseat or get rid of Sanders from the Senate running as a Republican. So Sanders is an example of an independent who has a personal connection with the place that he's at. He's built a long history of credibility. I mean, he's been in politics for like 40, 50 years now. And so he has a very specific brand that is identified with him. Some of our most successful politicians in the party system, though, have failed when they've tried to run as a third-party candidate. Teddy Roosevelt was an example of this. So he was a Republican president, and then he left the Republican Party and formed his own party called the Bull Moose Party because he was kind of upset with the direction that Republicans were headed, and he ran as a third-party candidate. He didn't win. That was actually the introduction of the Democrats back into the White House in the early 1900s. And so we have a two-party system, and it's really hard for independents to overcome some of those systemic barriers. You have to convince Republicans that you're better than their candidate, and Democrats that you're better than their candidate. Because if you're a third-party candidate and you kind of lean right, then the most likely thing to happen is that the Republican vote will split. If you're a third-party candidate that leans left, then the most likely thing to happen is that the Democratic vote will split, and then the other party in those situations benefits. So hopefully that makes sense. Aiden, Harley, any questions on that?
Yeah, so in the case of Bernie Sanders, we kind of talked about it. This is kind of what helped me understand, but I don't know if I have it all the way right. So the way that you, like as a third-party candidate, I feel like you almost have to appeal to one of the parties to gain support. Is that true? And in the case of Bernie Sanders, he has a lot of appeal with Democrats. There's a lot of things that he embellishes on that line up with Democrats. So is that a way that they can do it? Is just by kind of
co-opting an existing party platform? Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So a third-party candidate has to be able to identify a solid core of supporters. And if they can't do that, there's no way they're going to be able to run. And one of the easiest ways to do that is absolutely to take an existing political platform and say, I'm a Republican, only better, or I'm a Democrat, only better, and try and use that as leverage. But you'll notice that almost every independent candidate, if you guys go do research on this, has a really strong kind of personal brand identity that really resonates with their particular vote set.
So the only way a third-party candidate could win, or a potential way, is by being more moderate, so you split both the Democrat and Republican side, so that way you're not just splitting one party and the other party's going to win and benefit from it, but
you have to be
both
able to
splitting it.
capture. So either you have to be able to capture enough of the middle electorate. So I'm the moderate guy in between a far left and a far right candidate, or you have to be running in a place that's predominantly one party or the other. So in Utah, for example, as a state, we're predominantly conservative or Republican.
Yes.
And so for a third-party candidate in Utah, you wouldn't necessarily be running as a third-party liberal candidate, right? That's not going to help you in any way. But if you ran as a third-party conservative candidate because people were unhappy with the Republican Party, you might find a way to actually garner votes. Which is what happened in 2016. So in Utah, we actually had a three-way split between a Republican, a Democratic, and then a third-party candidate for the presidential election when Evan McMullin ran as a third-party conservative candidate. I mean, the Republican vote was still enough to give Trump the state, but it's one of the first times in modern history that Utah has not voted Republican with a majority of the voters. Trump won in Utah with less than 50% of the overall vote, which hasn't happened in recent history. So, good questions. Hopefully, this helps some of the students out there that were asking about this. And now for today's lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about the primary process. So again, we're going low tech and really low tech. I think everybody can see the board. If I want to get elected to the White House or to the Senate or to the House of Representatives, the very first thing that I need to do is join a party. So, and not just a party, but now based off of our conversation, one of two parties. Either we're joining the Democrats or we're joining the Republicans. Now, if I wanted the best chance to run for the Senate or the House in the state of Utah, what party would I probably join? Republican, right? But if I'm in Massachusetts, probably the Democrat, okay? And the reason for that is that each state has kind of a general identity or political identity. And we divide those into what we call red states and blue states. So red states are Republican, blue states are Democrat. And then there's a third, which is called a battleground or a purple state, which doesn't have a clearly defined party identity. So for example, Virginia right now is starting to be considered a purple state. So it has a lot of conservatives and a lot of liberals, so Republicans and Democrats, and it's possible for the state to go either way in any major election. And so those are what we, again, swing states or battleground states or purple states. And in that particular case, maybe the party I join has less impact on the overall ability for me to go ahead and actually get elected to an office. And again, if you guys have questions or stuff, go ahead and throw them in the chat and we'll try and respond as we see them. So I've joined a political party. The second major thing that we do now is we go through what we call the primary process. And if you have been paying attention to the news, other than COVID-19, one of the big political stories right now is the Democratic primary process. So we had a lot of Democratic nominees. This was similar back in 2016 where we had a lot of Republican nominees for their president. And then it winnowed super fast in the Democratic primary. So we had a lot of what we would call lanes, which is how political commentators refer to kind of what venue in the party you most appeal to. So am I a far right conservative, a middle conservative, a business first conservative, an anti-immigration conservative? Like what political brand within Republicanism do I identify with the most? And then the same thing on the Democratic side. And so in the Democratic primary that just happened, we had a couple of different lanes. We had the very progressive lane, which was largely Bernie Sanders and then Elizabeth Warren. Those were the two kind of standout candidates there. And then we had a more moderate lane, which had a lot of candidates in it. And this is where you saw Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg, Klobuchar, and then others like Kamala Harris, who had dropped out. And then this is where Bloomberg was trying to run as well. And so within a primary, you have voters only of a specific political party, so the Democrats or the Republicans, that are choosing their particular representative or nominee. So this is what the primary does, is we have different flavors of the Democratic Party or different flavors of the Republican Party coming together and trying to figure out who they want to be the one person that represents all Democrats or all Republicans in an upcoming general election. And we'll get to that in just a second. So I'm going to pause there. Questions so far about primaries? Anything you think that students might not have been clear on with the explanation that I just gave?
No.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit then about why primaries are so important and so impactful. And to do this, we are going to do a little bit of math, which is great. Everybody loves math. Okay, so let's assume that in the United States, we have 100 potential voters. Okay, so we have 100 citizens that are going to vote, and they're going to determine who our next president is going to be. So this is at the presidential level. We're ignoring things like the Electoral College. We're just talking about the voting population. If I divide that 100 people into major political parties, I have two. So I have Republicans and I have Democrats. What percentage of that population do you think strongly identifies as a Democrat or strongly identifies as a Republican in any given year?
I'd say it's close to 50-50.
Yeah.
Close to 50-50?
We'll say 52-48.
52-48. Aiden is wrong. Here's the actual breakout. So typically we have about 30% of the population that
Really?
identifies as a
Wow.
Democrat and about 30% of the population that strongly identifies as a
That makes
Republican.
sense.
So this accounts for, we'll give Aiden a second shot at this, what percent of the total population?
I'm guessing 60.
Say,
Yeah.
all right, we got 60%, which leaves Harley how many people that don't identify strongly with one of these two major parties?
40%.
See, we can do math. Okay. The way that the primary works is if I'm participating in a closed primary, which many primaries are, only members of my respective political party can participate. So if it's a closed Republican Party, only 30 Republicans would be able to participate. If it's a closed Democratic primary, only 30 Democrats would be able to participate.
So only if you're registered.
So only if you're registered and that self-identifies that particular political party. So as we talk about who is going to be the next president of the United States, it's going to be somebody from one of these two parties historically. We've never had an independent, right? And so we go into the primary process and we further subdivide these 30 people out. And actually we're going to just do a two-prong. So of these 30 people, how many are really, really strong Democrats and motivated to go participate in primaries?
5.
10.
5 is actually closer than 10.
Dang
Half.
it.
Yeah, so we're going to keep branching out to the left here for the Democrats, which means if we're talking percentage of the party here, what is this percentile? 15 to 20%-ish, okay? We don't have to be super accurate at this point. So this is our population that's going to decide who the Democratic presidential nominee is, okay? And the same thing happens on the Republican side. So we have about 25 people that are Republicans, but they don't really participate in primaries. And then we have 5 really strong Republicans that are going to go out and actively participate in this primary process. Now, this is where it starts to get even more interesting. These 5 people on both sides, when we look at the political spectrum, so here's dead center, here's far right, here's far left, our primary participants tend to be clustered at the edges, okay? So these are the ones with the strongest political views and the political views that are furthest from the center. The majority of the population is right here. The majority of the Democratic Party might be right here, and the majority of the Republican Party might be right there. But the people that participate in primaries typically are individuals that are at the furthest extremes of their respective political ideologies. And so again, when we're talking about who is going to be the next president of the United States, what the primary process does is almost guarantee that that person is going to be further away from the middle than most other candidates.
Interesting. So is it just like this because people who are more dedicated to their party are more likely to vote? Is that where it...
So why does this happen?
Yeah.
Passion.
That's a good question. Yeah, so we have definitely a passion thing, right? People who are most passionate about their respective political ideology are going to be the ones that are most likely to go ahead and participate in the primary process. And typically the most passionate people are not moderates,
Mm-hmm.
right? You don't describe moderates as passionate moderates. Moderates are generally, yeah, I think we should be moderate about this thing, and that impacts all sorts of other aspects of my life. The really big firebrands are always the ones that are like, this is the extreme position we need to have. Bernie bros are the most vocal supporters on the left, right? And they're supporters of a very significantly left-leaning kind of ideology. When you look on the right, the strongest conservative voices back in the 2010 election are the Tea Partiers. And then when you talk about Trump's nomination in 2016, it's a very specific brand of republicanism. I don't know if many of you remember this, but in 2016, there were a lot of Republicans that actually didn't like the fact that Trump was the nominee. And they became what was known as never-Trumpers. Most of those, I think, have mostly gone away. But there was this idea that Trump didn't actually represent the values of the Republican Party. And there's a lot of Democrats that feel like Bernie Sanders doesn't represent the values of the Democratic Party. But the people who are actually participating in these primaries largely are the most passionate, and they tend to have ideologies furthest away from the center. Okay, so does this make sense so far?
Yeah.
Any other questions or follow-ups on that? Anything from the chat? Oh, this is Becky threw in something. Yeah, this is why it is important for everybody to participate, right? Becky is our political activist. That's why we brought her on as our TA. So as we look at this, something to keep in mind now is just about how democratic the overall system is. So if I have a candidate that comes from the Democratic or the Republican Party, what percentage of my population is actually picking presidential candidates based off of this breakout?
5% of the population.
Well, 10%.
Well, 10%, but 5% for each party.
Yep.
Yeah.
So out of 100 potential voters, 10% of the population is actually picking who our next president is going to be, because it's going to be one of these two people. It's going to be the Dem or it's going to be the Republican. That's it. That's how it works, because we have a two-party system. And so going kind of Becky's point, that is why it's really important that if you want to make an impact in your local politics and in your national politics, this is the place to get involved, is here in these closed primaries. Because if you wait until the general election, well, your choices are already largely determined. You're going to have whoever the far-right Republicans and whoever the far-left Democrats think is going to be our best bet, most of the time. Now, Joe Biden is an interesting case, right? So 2016, the Republican Party fell apart during the primary process. Donald Trump actually didn't win with majority votes in most of his primaries. He won like he did in Utah with what we call a plurality, meaning he had the most votes, but it wasn't 50% of the support. Bernie Sanders was winning the Democratic primary based off of those same guidelines. Because there were so many people in the Republican field back in 2016, the vote didn't really coalesce around the not Trump candidate. There were several not Trump candidates, and they divided the vote multiple ways. That was happening here in the Democratic primary as well, until all of a sudden, right before Super Tuesday, the big dividers of the moderate Democratic vote suddenly dropped out. Pete Buttigieg dropped out, Klobuchar dropped out, and instantly cleared the way for Joe Biden. And then Elizabeth Warren did Joe Biden a favor by really beating the snot out of Mike Bloomberg in a couple of prior debates and showing him perhaps not as a strong a candidate as people thought he would, even though he invested maybe $1 billion into this thing. It's a crazy amount of money. And so Joe Biden all of a sudden had this clear path because he was the only moderate Democratic primary nominee. So it was Biden versus Sanders, and the Democratic Party as a whole is more moderate than Sanders is. And so most people track towards Biden. So that's kind of what happened in the last two presidential elections. In 2016, the candidate that least represented the Republican Party won because the vote was divided in so many ways. In 2020, the Democratic candidate that most represents most Democratic Party members' ideologies is winning because the vote was not divided. All right, so we have a question in here. If a candidate wins a state, how does that transfer over to other voting processes? So we're going to focus just on the primary. It's a good question. If Bernie Sanders wins the state of Utah, the next step in the primary is to have what we call a convention. So here at a convention, and both parties do this every presidential cycle, every person, so here's candidate A, candidate B, candidate C. Man, my handwriting is bad like this. Each of these people won so many states, and from those states they received a number of delegates. Okay, so candidate A won a few states and came in with 300. Good grief, this is bad. 300 delegates. Candidate B won a couple states and came in with 250. I can't do this. I'm gonna have to turn the board. Okay, 250. Man, that is bad B. And candidate C came in with 150. Okay, so if we look at the total delegate count, nobody has 50% of the overall delegates here because we're dealing with 700 delegates. Somebody needs at least 351 in order to win this thing. So each state awarded each of these candidates a certain amount of delegates. And then at the convention, if nobody is over the 50 plus 1 threshold, then they go through multiple voting phases where these delegates are then allowed to kind of shift their votes between multiple candidates. And so maybe A has 300, but C looks at A and says, we don't like him. I'm going to give all of my delegates are going to go to candidate B, putting them over the threshold. So that's what we would call a brokered convention, which is what the Democrats looked like they were going to do this year until Joe Biden started basically cleaning up the primary process. So hopefully that answers your question. As far as how these impact other kinds of votes, they don't. This is just the primary process. I win a state, I get a delegate, that delegate votes for me in the convention, and if I have 50 plus 1, then I become the nominee for my entire political party. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, so as a candidate, we have joined a political party. We have gone through the primary process. And now we are going to go ahead and go to step 3 in getting elected, which is the general election. So again, join the party. We primaried. And now we have the general election. The general election is what most people are familiar with within the United States because this is where the most people participate. Oddly enough, we don't have a huge voter turnout in the U.S. We actually typically have anywhere from 40 to 60% voter turnout on any given year. We don't have mandatory voting in the United States. Some other democracies do. And so only about 40 to 60% of our electorate turns out during the general election process. And it's during the general election that you see campaigning between the two major political parties typically reach a peak. So the Republican nominee and the Democratic nominee will go ahead and actively campaign for the office and typically actively campaign against each other. Now this, and we'll talk a little bit more about the general election, this process happens for all national party positions. So when you talk about, again, a seat in Congress, whether it's the House or the Senate or a place in the White House, you're going through this process. If I'm running for a national office, this primary extends to all of the states in the United States, plus some territories, plus citizens that live outside the U.S., and the general election happens nationally. And, well, for the president, it happens nationally. If I'm running for a state office, then my primary only happens in my state. And my general election only happens in my state. So if I'm running for Congress from Utah, for example, I would primary only in the state of Utah, and I would have a general election only in the state of Utah. It's the presidency that happens at the national level. I explained that kind of funky, I'm sorry, guys. So any questions on this? Why is voting turnout so low? That's a really good question. There has been a lot of discussion into this and a lot of research actually by political scientists trying to figure out why people don't actively participate in democratic institutions. What do you guys think?
I think a lot of people just think their vote doesn't matter. They won't do anything to affect the outcome.
Yeah, that's something that I think a lot of people think, and it's sometimes how I feel too. But I just now have a hard time understanding why Americans, like why we've let that happen and don't vote when we see that, 10% of people in the country determine who the candidate is for the primary elections. It's hard to understand because when you had that chart up, if more moderate people voted and were passionate about having more moderate candidates, our presidents would be more moderate.
Yeah, they absolutely would.
Yeah, it's hard to wrap my mind around it, but
we're the solution, but we're complaining, but we're not really doing
Yeah.
anything about it.
Exactly.
It's the American way, guys. Like, that's how we function. So I think this is part of it, and I want to go into this first part first, which is we think our vote doesn't matter. So why do you think your vote doesn't matter? What gives you the impression that your vote doesn't matter?
Well, I think a lot of people think of elections in just the general election terms. When you talk about the primaries, it's very obvious that our votes do matter, but most people just aren't aware of what goes on in the primaries. So I think just a misunderstanding of how the elections work caused that line of thinking.
And I think too, when we think about this is like more from an individual way of thinking. It's like, oh, well, it's just one vote. Is it really going to make a difference? And I think that we sometimes feel like we have to know we're part of a huge group of people that's voting for one person, and that might be why we vote for a candidate that has a lot of support, but one that we don't necessarily believe in. But yeah, I just think that sometimes we think, oh, it's just one vote, why does it matter? But if you look at if everyone voted, the difference that it would make, and you voting is a part of that, and it does matter and it does count. It's just hard to see and to feel that it does matter when you're just one person in a big country.
Yeah, and so I think there's a couple of things there that are definitely pertinent to the question at hand. We are herd animals, we're social animals, okay, and so I think that when you have really successful political candidates, we're going to focus at the presidential level just because I think it's the one most people are familiar with. Obama inspired a lot of voter turnout, especially in specific communities, because he was able to bring some passion into that voting population. They really were excited by him. Trump did the same thing in specific voting communities in 2016. And so having a candidate that really inspires individuals for whatever reason, can help them go ahead and increase voter turnout. One thing to be cognizant of, though, is that our system really does go ahead and make it so that your vote doesn't matter at the presidential level. And I'm going to explain why as we talk about what's known as the Electoral College. So in the United States, we don't have a popular vote that determines who our president is. We have something known as the Electoral College. And again, I apologize for my handwriting, it's terrible. The way that this works is every state is assigned a certain amount of electors in the Electoral College. And those electors come based off of how many people serve in the House and how many people serve in the Senate. So larger states have more Electoral College votes because they have more people serving in the House. Every state is guaranteed at least 3 because every state has at least 2 senators and 1 representative in the House. And so every state has at least 3 Electoral College votes. In the United States, and we talked about this last week, we have a first past the post system, meaning it's winner take all. And that applies to Electoral College votes as well. And we can take Utah as an example of this. So in the state of Utah, do you guys know how many Electoral College votes we have? We have 2 senators, so there's 2.
At least 4.
At least 4, okay.
Maybe 6.
5.
All right, super confident. We actually have 6, okay?
Hey.
So we have 6 Electoral College votes. Now, in the 2016 presidential election, so we're going to look at 2016, right? We actually have 3 major candidates that receive a significant portion of the vote share. We have the Republican candidate, we have the Democratic candidate, and we have an independent candidate. The Republican is Donald Trump, the Democrat is Hillary Clinton, and the independent is McMullen, Evan McMullen, thanks.
They
Just
don't
spaced
even
his name.
remember his name.
It's terrible, right? So Donald Trump won approximately, I think it was 45% of the overall vote in Utah. And then the other 55% was split between largely Hillary Clinton and McMullen. I think McMullen won like 20 to 25%, and maybe it was 30. Sure, we'll say he won 30% because nobody likes Hillary in Utah. Sad but true, right, guys? So in this particular breakout, nobody won 50% of the vote. Yet somebody won more votes than anybody else. It was Republican nominee. So our Electoral College votes went all to the Republican nominee, even though they didn't win the majority of the votes in the state. This is first past the post or winner take all kinds of systems. That means that if you're a Democrat or a non-Republican in the state of Utah, does your vote matter in most presidential elections?
Well, I would say, looking at this, if I was an independent, and I've heard a lot of people that don't belong to a political party say this, it's like you almost have to vote for a Republican or a Democrat. You can't vote for the candidate you believe in, because it's like, I don't want to say it's a wasted vote, because it does matter and it does count that you want that person, but it just goes for nothing. Like,
So it is a waste.
Is
no,
it?
no vote is a waste. I'm not gonna. I think
did
every
nothing,
vote
you did
does
nothing.
count, but it really does nothing. But
So
it does matter.
So you just said it's a waste.
It's
You said it's for
It
nothing.
matters to the person. No,
well,
voting for. I think.
I'm just kidding.
I think
I know what
voting
you're
for
saying.
something that you believe in, it counts for something. Like, no matter what. But
well, and we'll talk actually about what your vote can do, even if it doesn't put your candidate into office, right? But so this particular situation contributes to this idea that your vote doesn't matter. Because if I live, let's switch this, okay? Let's say that I live in a strongly Democratic state, Massachusetts, right? Or Hawaii. Hawaii is an even better example. And I'm a conservative. No matter what, I will never see my state's electoral college votes go to the presidency, to the candidate for president that I want. Because in a first past the post system, the Democrats are always going to win all of the votes in Hawaii, right? They're going to have a majority, they're going to have the most votes, and so they're going to win all of the electoral college votes. This disincentivizes individuals who feel outside of the formal political system or the formal political party in their state from actively participating at the presidential level. Because again, when they look at this, they say, it doesn't matter. There's more of them than me, and all of these electoral college votes are going to go to whoever gets the most. These aren't proportionally divided. It's a winner-take-all system. So that is why it can disincentivize active participation. We have Americans that live in states that say, hey, why would I bother voting? Because I'm in the minority political party, and there's going to be enough of the other guys out there that my vote's not actually going to change anything. Now, that's not the best attitude to have, as Harley indicated, because even though Donald Trump won all of the electoral college votes in the state of Utah, it's a place that he won with only a plurality and not a majority, and the state has historically been extraordinarily conservative. So for him to win here with less than 50% of the vote sent a certain kind of message to the Trump administration about Utah voters, which is, yeah, we prefer Republican ideals, but we don't perhaps like you as our presidential candidate. We prefer conservative ideology, but we're not really happy that you happen to be the banner carrier of that particular flag right now. And this can happen no matter the political persuasion. And this happens based off of voter turnout as well. The reason that senior citizens in the United States receive more political attention is because when you look at voter breakouts, seniors vote. They go out and they actively participate. Bernie Sanders lost the presidential primary. He hasn't lost it yet, but he's likely to lose the Democratic primary because he banked on young voters coming out and voting for him. And guess what? Y'all sucked it up, right? Like, there was no huge youth wave that came out and said, yay, Bernie, even though they're, shit posting all over the internet left and right. Sorry for my language. Like, the Bernie bros are this huge internet army that never materialized into actual votes. And if you want politicians to take you seriously, you vote, even if that vote doesn't result in a win for you in that particular election. Because just by actively participating, you signal to politicians that I'm somebody you need to listen to. If you don't listen to me, this might have a consequence somewhere down the line. So yeah, your vote does matter, even if it doesn't necessarily get you an electoral college vote. But this process, people intuitively pick up on it. I'm a Democrat in a conservative state. I'm a Republican in a liberal state. Why bother voting? It's not going to matter. All right, so let's spend a couple of minutes in trying to work through some of these questions that have popped up in chat. So is moderate in the U.S. really moderate from a global perspective? It's a good question. What do you guys think, based off of your infinite life wisdom?
Oh.
Travel the world.
Well, no, so Harley's lived abroad for a little while. Aiden's traveled around. What do you guys think?
I, in my opinion, would say yes. From what I've seen, and just from my experience living in Utah. Yeah, keep that in mind. I think that most moderate people are very moderate, and I think that they do understand there needs to be a balance and that there are good things in both parties as well as bad things in both parties. And so I would say that American moderates are moderate compared to the rest of the world. That's my opinion.
Yeah.
Just going with yeah.
I don't have anything to add.
Okay, so this is a really good question. There are 4 lines here. This is generally speaking where the U.S. political system is. So if we were to look at far left ideology, meaning this is the furthest left that any person ever thinks, this is the furthest right that any person ever thinks. So we have fascism over here and communism over there. The American political system is right here in the middle, which means that typically even our furthest right policies are much more moderate than the furthest right policies of other nations. Our furthest left policies are much more moderate than even the furthest left policies of other nations. So American moderates, when you look at the political ideology, man, they hang out like right here. And so the U.S. tends to be a very moderate nation from a political standpoint, in part because of the two-party system. The two-party system encourages moderation. Because we talked about this primary, right? So let's say I've got a primary candidate from the Dems here and a primary candidate from the Republicans here. At best, they're probably only going to get 30% of the vote each, which isn't enough. In order to get over that 50% threshold, they've got to appeal to the center, which means during a general election, again, presidential, we'll focus on presidential elections, both of the political parties tend to tack towards the center.
And isn't it true once a president is like in office, a lot of their extreme views tend to be more moderate once they're in because they realize they can't do much unless they appeal to the more moderates?
Because a president isn't a king, right? So if a president is going to do something, they have to work with Congress and they have to work within the existing legal system, which means that a lot of their extremist ideas don't happen because the system itself forces moderation.
Like building a wall?
Like building a wall. Yep. All right. So we've got another one. Is it true that non-voters elected Trump into office? I honestly can't answer that. I mean, they didn't elect him into office because they didn't vote. But if you mean, did voter turnout have an impact on the Trump election? Absolutely. So one of the things that Hillary Clinton was not able to duplicate in 2016 was black turnout that Obama was able to benefit from in 2008 and 2012. If more black voters had turned out in places like Michigan and Wisconsin, she would be president of the United States right now. Because those people didn't love her or want to participate as actively as they did when Obama was the nominee, they didn't vote, which meant that the overall percentage of the vote was now in favor of the Republican nominee in those states. So it's a good question. Why does the U.S. use first past the post and not proportionally? So we're actually going to talk about proportional representation on Thursday. That's the big conversation for class on Thursday. But one of the major benefits, which I just indicated here, is that this system does encourage moderation, right? So even if I'm a far right or a far left nominee, I have a small percentage of the population that agrees with me. And because it's winner take all and power isn't divided proportionally, in order to get enough votes to win it all, I've got to tack to the center. And so this system tends to be more moderate than political systems that allow more proportional representation. The other thing is that this system is more stable. And I think this is a really important thing to note. You can have an ideal government from an ideological perspective, Cuba, North Korea, right? So they espouse certain kinds of ideologies. But the stability of that government and its ability to perpetuate itself using democratic means over times is non-existent in the case of both of those nations. So if I was a democratically minded individual and I wanted to actively participate in my political process, Cuba and North Korea are terrible places for me to live, because I don't. The government rules everything. The other thing that leads to stability is that because this is a bipolar system, there's always going to be a give and take between only two major power centers. So they balance each other out kind of naturally. The system itself tends to balance. In political processes where you have proportional representation, you have multiple power centers form. And the Israeli Knesset is a fantastic example of how unstable government can be in that environment. I think they voted 4 times now, maybe it's just 3, 3 or 4 times in the last year for basically picking who their president is going to be. Imagine if in 2016 we had to vote 4 different times before we figured out if Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton was going to be our president. And imagine the impact that that would have on economic systems and other political systems throughout the country. Like that could be hugely worrisome. And so this bipolar winner-take-all system is less fair than proportional systems. It is, but it's more stable and it tends to be more moderate. So we've continued to stick with it. Plus, it benefits the 2 major parties in power, and they really don't see a reason to be more proportionally minded. Like they're not going to benefit from that. All right. Who do you vote for if none of the candidates are a good fit? Who do you vote for, Aiden? You don't like anybody who's running. Who do you vote for?
Well, I think just going back to what you were saying, vote for the person you feel like would be best. And if everyone does that, it's going to send a message to the administration of what the voter population is like in a certain state. So even if they don't get elected, it's a good sign for the government.
Yeah, I'm actually a big proponent of voting your conscience if you feel like a strategic vote doesn't do any good. And here's what I mean by that. A strategic vote, for the example in the case of Utah, Democrats might have realized there's no way Hillary Clinton's going to win Utah, right? But they really don't want Donald Trump to win Utah, so they might hold their nose and strategically vote for Evan McMullin. And they might say, there's no way Hillary's going to win, but Evan McMullin might get enough support to deny Trump the 6 electoral college votes from Utah, so I'm going to vote strategically. That means that you're not voting your conscience, you're doing what you think is going to have the best outcome from a power perspective. Now, that's a fine way to vote. A lot of people do that. It's a completely rational kind of action. You don't always have to vote that way, though. If you look at somebody and you say, I really don't want to vote for them, and I really don't want to vote for the other person, you should still actively participate. Because if you looked at this population again, we have 100 people voting, and only 30 people voted for the Republican, and only 30 people voted for the Democrat, and the other 40 people looked at both of them and said, we're writing in Donald Duck. What does that say to these 2 major political parties? That they've lost it, right? That they are not doing enough to appeal to citizens in the United States. And so that's going to help them, hopefully, come more towards the ideology that the majority of these citizens want to see happen in a governance standpoint. So absolutely participate. Even a vote that's a vote of conscience that doesn't lead to any kind of direct power for the person that you're looking for still sends messages to politicians that I didn't vote for you because you didn't do it for me. And that's important. So good questions. All right, anything else before we kind of continue on? We've got about 4 minutes left.
Yeah, and I would just say along with that, when someone is elected president, if you didn't vote for them, if you don't agree with the things they're doing, they're still, when someone's elected president, they're the president of the United States. They are there to serve and help all Democrats and all Republicans. And I like what Aiden said about presidents becoming a bit more moderate, and I feel like they almost have to. And so I just think that's important to note too, is that when you do vote, it sends that message not only to politicians but to the president, because they're going to look at who voted for them and they're going to see everyone that didn't and the percentages where they were. And so I just think that's important to note too.
Yeah, and one last kind of note on this is if you don't vote at all, you have no right to complain about anything. Like that's just that's how this works. If you don't actively participate in the democratic process and then you start complaining about all the decisions that a government makes, you kind of got no leg to stand on in that situation. But if you go out and you actively participate and you say, I disagree with the decisions that are being made, I would like other decisions to be made, at least from my perspective, that makes you not a hypocrite. I mean, you can legitimately criticize your government and say, I don't like it, but only if you're actively participating in the process of governance. And for most of us, that means going out and voting. All right, we are just about out of time, so there's one last thing that I do want to mention. Before class on Thursday, or the lecture on Thursday, make sure you guys watch the 2 videos that I posted. They're available here on the YouTube description page, and they're also available in the email that I sent out to everybody. Those will give a good breakout of what proportional representation is, which means that our conversation on Thursday, we can spend less time explaining what it is, and we can spend more time talking about why it matters and if it's something the United States should consider. All right. So, any last thoughts before we stop for today?
The overall theme is go out and vote.
Yep. Go participate. You guys stay safe out there. Stock up your ice cream supplies, and we'll see you again on Thursday.